today we get to learn about how to get your garden growing, which is wonderful this time of year because we have some plants that can go in now and some after the frost. And with us today is Candace Schaible. She has been leading and developing outreach and communication education programs for Utah State University Extension Program in Iron County, Utah since 2008. Her areas of focus include urban agriculture and home landscape, with an emphasis in water use and conservation. She's a graduate of South Dakota University horticulture program and earned a degree in adult education from Utah State University. Candace, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to just chatting with you guys about your gardens today. So we're going to keep this short and sweet, and if you have any questions, please chime in. How does that look on your end?
That looks great.
All right, I got some thumbs up, so we'll move forward. Okay, so just a few things to kind of get you guys started. It's always nice to know what planting zone you're in. Here in Cedar City, we're considered zone 6. If you really want to get specific, 6B, we're kind of on the warmer end of the 6 scale. And I'll show you that scale here it's over on the right side of the screen. That dark green is zone 6. So we're anywhere between -10 to 0 degrees at our lowest point in winter. And they get a little bit more specific and bumped us up a bit to 6B. So our average is kind of -5 to 0. Keep in mind, Cedar City does have a lot of microclimates. I noticed that if you're closer to the university, you can go a little bit warmer. If you're closer to the mountain, you tend to be a little bit warmer in the winter. And then the further out in the valley, or if you get into Enoch or Parowan or Paraguna, it just gets a little colder and colder. So if you're out in Enoch or Parowan, I'd probably bump this down to a zone 5 versus a zone 6, just to be safe. And this is really just going to pertain to your perennial crops. So if you're planting asparagus or artichokes or any herbs like thyme that are going to come back year after year, it's nice to know what you're working with in the wintertime. So on average, we have, and this is just kind of Cedar City proper, we have about 135 days that are frost-free. And it's nice to know this because when you start looking at dates to maturity, when you're reading either seed packets or the plant tags at the nursery, and it tells you that it might take that watermelon 110 days to mature, it's good to know that you have about a 25-day buffer. So knowing that, you might want to choose a watermelon that doesn't take as many days to mature, or take some measures to extend your growing season. And we'll talk about that in just a second. On average, our last frost date is about May 20th. Keep in mind that this is an average. We have seen frosts into June, but then on the other end of that, just checking the forecast, the next 10 days looks really good. So I've put some more season crops in the ground. I planted some tomatoes. And I'll just keep an eye on those temperatures. And if it's going to get, I like to be on the safe side. So if it's going to get colder than 33, 34 degrees at night, I'll just take an old bed sheet and just throw it out over everything and take it off in the morning. And we're usually good to go. Our average first frost of fall is about October 5th. So that usually starts to mark the end of the growing season. But Cedar City's, it's kind of it's just got a neat little climate to it. So while our average is October 5th, a lot of times you can keep that garden growing till the end of November. So let's talk, I want to show you this quick little video, and I'm just going to voice over as they show you this frost cloth. These are what we call season extenders. And Agribond is a trade name, a product name, but what you're looking at here is frost cloth, and it's almost like a cheesecloth-like material that you can stretch over your plants. And depending on the type that you buy, you can get up to 6 to 8 degrees of protection. So you can put this right on top of your plants. You could create these little hoops and create a little, not really a greenhouse per se, but just a little hoop over your crops. And then you want to make sure you weigh down the sides. Another benefit to this frost cloth is insect protection. This is a really simple and non-chemical way to keep insects off of your garden. You can also make the hoops a little bit bigger. This is my garden, and I just pounded a PVC pipe into the ground, similar to that video that I just showed you, and then just stretched some electrical conduit over the beds. And then in the spring, I'll stretch this greenhouse plastic on top, and then just use zip ties to kind of crank the ends down and keep everything secure. And that buys you about a month on either end of the growing season. And it also allows you to grow cool season crops like lettuce and spinach and any of your salad greens all year round, it's kind of fun to go out and harvest a salad in the middle of December or January. So let's talk a little bit about when to plant, and you guys are welcome to grab a screenshot of this or take a picture. But I just kind of summarize our FrostFree dates. And then I also put a website up here if you want to grab soil temperature information for your area. They use soil temperature a lot to determine when it's time to plant a lot of your seeds, and like seed potatoes, because they require a certain soil temp before they'll actually germinate. So we're mid-May, so just kind of bumping forward on the scale to that, and then I'll go backwards. We're getting really close to being able to plant all of our warm season crops. The vegetables are really classified into two groups. We have cool season crops, which like the cool temperatures. They don't really like the heat of the summer. They start to go dormant and go into reproductive mode and start to produce seeds. And then we have warm season crops that don't like the cool temperatures. And these would be like your tomatoes and your zucchinis and peppers. And they do well when the threat of frost has passed. So I just marked May 20th on this calendar. And then looking in, so we're really to the point where you could plant all your warm season crops. And then moving in towards the end of July, usually around Pioneer Day, if you wanted to plant a second round of cool season crops, so if you wanted to put some lettuce seed in the ground, that's a great time to do that for a fall harvest. And then just looking a little bit later, if you want to plant garlic, garlic is one of the things you plant in the fall, and it's really similar to a tulip, where it needs that cold spell before it will really do anything that will make you happy as the homeowner. So you plant that anywhere between September and the first part of November, and then it just sits all winter, and then starts to come up in the spring, and you usually harvest that around the 4th of July. And then just planning ahead for you for next year, about mid-March is the time when I plant most of my cool season crops. So I'll plant again, my lettuce and spinach and kale and just all of those leafy greens that I really like. And then about mid-April, we kind of have a family Easter tradition where we'll plant our potatoes mid-April. Okay, so just talking about different types of plants that you can purchase. You can really purchase things from seed, or you can purchase things from transplants. And transplants would be the little plants that you buy at the nursery. And there's two different types, just to be really broad. There's heirlooms and there's hybrids. And both of them are great. They both have their place. Hybrids are, think of your kids. A hybrid is a cross between two different parents, and the product is the child that you get. And so it's hard to save seeds from those varieties because you're not always sure who the parents are. You have to make that cross exact in order to get the seeds to produce the next generation. With heirloom varieties, they are true to type, meaning that if I saved my seeds from a tomato plant that's of an heirloom variety, I would get the same tomato the next year, assuming it wasn't cross-pollinated with anything. You really can, you can start your seeds on your own. You can purchase them from transplants at the nursery. It's totally up to you. But one bit of advice I would give you, especially if you're a new gardener, I would start small and only plant things that you're going to eat. If you're not a big fan of broccoli, don't waste the space and plant broccoli. Another thing I like to think about, my garden isn't huge, so I don't plant. I'd love to plant corn, but it's so cheap at the store and the farmer's market that I just opt out of planting corn and I purchase it. And then I don't usually plant zucchini because I feel like everybody and their neighbor has zucchini, and when it starts to become ripe, you end up having more than you need. So just think about those things as well. So this is a list of cool season crops. So these are all things that you would have already started in your garden about a month and a half ago, or things that you could start in the fall, have a pretty nice fall crop. And most of it are your root crops like onions, potatoes, carrots, and then any leafy greens. So if you think about what you put in a salad, like kale, or you might put chives in your salad, or chard, or lettuce, things like that. Those are all cool season crops. And then warm crops are everything else. When it comes to seed versus transplants, part of it is up to you, and part of it is really up to the plant. Some things like tomatoes and peppers they take a lot of time from the moment you plant the seed until the point where you start getting fruit. And our growing season just isn't that long. And so you really benefit from purchasing transplants of tomatoes and peppers, because you can get them in the ground and kind of skip the first month and a half. If you are planting seeds, I always get asked how deep I should go. And just kind of a quick rule of thumb is a 3 times rule. So if you lay that seed flat in your hand, you want to plant it about 3 times deeper than however thick it lays when it's sitting on your hand. And there's a lot of seeding approaches. When I do my lettuce beds, I just kind of let my kids loose and they just scatter the seeds everywhere, and I'm okay with that. If you want more of a row, like if you're planting beans, you may want more of a row. And then thinning, you can always thin. It does make more space for the plants that you're planting to fully mature. I personally do not thin because I tend to be a lazy gardener. And the nice thing about root crops is you can eat them at any stage. And so I'll start plucking carrots just as soon as I see them starting to come up. And that thinning and eating is just a natural thinning process. So by the end of the season, I get really big carrots. First part of the season, they're small and a little bit distorted because they're so tight. So it's totally a personal preference. When you're looking at buying transplants, again, tomatoes, peppers, you would want to purchase from transplants just because they do take a little longer before you get fruit. Smaller is always better. And I know that's kind of it might be a little bit of a mind-blowing statement, but plants will, how do I want to say this? They will set roots and adapt really quickly, and they do that a lot faster when they're smaller. The bigger plants get a bit more transplant shock and a little bit stunted, and it takes them a little more time to mature and start to do what you want them to do. And it's a lot easier to dig a small hole than it is to dig a big hole. When it comes to warm season crops that just do, or even cool season, that just do a lot better from transplants, or I'm sorry, from seeds versus transplants, that list is fairly small, but keep in mind that there's no need to purchase corn or beans or melons or garlic or potatoes or even cilantro as transplants. It's a lot cheaper to buy them from seed, and they actually establish a lot faster if you plant them from seed. Just one example, melons are notorious for transplant shock, and that process of taking them out of the container and putting them in the ground really stunts their growth. And so if you have kids, or if this interests you and you wanted to do an experiment, you could buy a melon transplant and then buy the same seed and plant both in the ground on the same day, and just kind of take note of which one takes off the fastest. There's a few different types of plants out there. Bulbs, so I'm just going to kind of group everything into a really general category. Bulbs would be like garlic or onions or anything that kind of produces that bulb underneath the soil. These can be planted in the spring or fall, with the exception of garlic. Garlic really needs that cold time frame. So you would plant those in the fall, and then you would harvest the following year. The tops, if you're harvesting the tops of your onions or the tops of your beets or garlic, you can really harvest those anytime. And I'm not going to get into fertilizer because this is kind of a brief introductory class, and fertilizer is so variable based on your soil type. And so what I will say about that is we do offer soil testing through Utah State University, and it's just over $20 to have your soil analyzed, and it's really helpful to know where you're at nutrient wise. And I like to do that in my garden about every 2 to 3 years, just to see where I'm at. And then on my lawn and other landscape things, mostly my lawn, I like to do it every 3 to 4 years just to get a base, make sure things are in check. Flowers would be any flower parts that you eat, like broccoli or cauliflower. You want to harvest these when the buds tend to be firm and tight. And these are a little finicky in our climate because once it starts to get warm, they get pretty bitter and they do not taste good. And so I've noticed that we have better luck with these if you're planting them in the fall, because we have our temperatures seem to be a bit less variable in the fall than they are in the spring. So if you've been struggling with these, give them a shot in the fall and see if they work better for you. And then potatoes are always fun. I always seem to have volunteer potatoes every year, which I volunteer everything every year, which I kind of love. It's always a little bit of a surprise. With potatoes, you want to plant them in the spring, and again, you can really harvest anytime. One of the things I like to do is I'll dig a trench, and then I just cut up the potatoes into little chunks and just let my kids throw them into the trench, and then we cover it up with maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch of soil. And then as soon as those plants start to grow up through that soil, we'll throw a little bit more soil on. And eventually, I mean, my trench is only about 1 foot deep. So eventually that soil is about 1 foot, a foot deeper than it originally was when we planted. And we just let them do their thing, and we'll start, usually about the 4th of July, I'll start harvesting my potatoes, and I just kind of start on one end of the trench, and I'll dig up a few, and I'll pull some potatoes for some potato salad, and then I'll kind of just replant the plants, kind of put them back where they were and tap them in, and then I'll move on to the next section. And it works pretty well. So I harvest potatoes almost all summer long. I don't have a storage area, so doing one big harvest and then storing them all winter long isn't something that I'm able to do. So this is a method that works really well for me. I get a lot of questions about crop rotation, and yes, it's important. The reason we want to rotate our crops is because there are some plants, like let's use potatoes and tomatoes, for example, that are really prone to some soil-borne diseases. And so if I were to plant my potatoes and tomatoes in the same spot year after year, those soil-borne diseases start to build, and eventually I'll have some issues, and I won't be able to plant there anymore. There'll be quite a bit that I'll have to do to the soil before I can plant potatoes or tomatoes there again. And so one easy way just to help this and to keep your soil in good shape is just to rotate your crops. I group mine by their family type. So tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, eggplants, they're all in the nightshade family. And so I plant one entire bed with my nightshade crops. I have 3 raised beds. I'll do another bed with all my salad crops and my herbs, and then I'll do another bed with everything that vines. So my melons and cucumbers, anything of that nature. And then I'll just essentially to really just rotate the whole bed. So you can kind of see in this example, let's go down to grow bed 2. The very first year I planted, it was tomatoes, peppers, potatoes. And then I took everything I planted in that bed and I planted it in bed 3 the following year. So you can kind of, you can keep it really simple, and there is some benefit. So it is something I would encourage. So just briefly talking about irrigation, there's a lot of ways to water your garden. I like drip irrigation for a number of reasons. The one being convenience. I can put it on a timer The biggest benefit to the plants is that I'm putting the water directly where I need it, and I'm keeping the tops of the leaves dry, so I'm limiting my disease problems. From a water conservation standpoint, it is the most efficient way to get water to the root system. But I will say, from a therapy standpoint, if I'm having a bad day, there's something very therapeutic about hand watering my garden. So most of the time I use drip, but I completely appreciate that every watering type has their place. My favorite drip and the simplest to use is just they call it an inline drip. So it's just a drip tubing, it's got emitters in the line. And you can get those spaced 6 to 12 inches apart. I like the 6-inch spacing personally. And then I just create a grid-like pattern in my raised beds, and I'm really watering the bed as a whole because I'm planting pretty intensely. So I want to get all of those roots wet, and those roots encompass the. So there's a lot of different types of drip out there. My personal favorite is the inline drip. So it's just drip tubing and the emitters are already in the line, and you can get the spacing anywhere from 6 to 12 inches apart. I like the 6-inch spacing, and then I just create a grid-like pattern in my garden bed, and it's really easy to use. So just to kind of give you a visual, I do have raised beds, and I plant pretty intensely. So I like to water the entire bed because the whole thing will be encompassed with roots as things mature. One thing that I really love is having an on-off valve on each of my raised garden beds or on each of my sections of my garden. And then that just allows me to control what comes on and what doesn't. So if I'm planting crops early and I have one bed planted, I don't have to water my other beds. I can just focus the water on that one. So talking about soil, there's always lots of questions about soil, and I'm going to keep this really simple, and then if there's further questions, feel free to reach out or ask. And I'm going to look at two separate things. So if you're doing your garden in the ground, we do have some pretty heavy clay soil, which is actually kind of amazing because it holds water really well and it holds nutrients really well, but it can be kind of hard to work with. And so adding organic matter is really your best friend, whether you're dealing with a heavy clay soil or a fairly sandy soil. The benefits are similar on both sides. But you do need to be aware that there's different types of organic matter. If you're looking at compost from the animal side, it's very high in nutrients, which is great, but nutrients equal salt. So it's also going to have a lot of salt in it. So you have to use this in moderation. On the plant-based side, so if you're using grass clippings or leaves or kitchen scraps, the nutrient content is fairly low, meaning the salt content is also fairly low. So you can really go crazy with the plant-based stuff and not do any harm to the garden. I always get asked a lot if I could add sand to the soil to break up the clay. The very short answer is no. Mixing sand and clay together is one of the ways that you can make adobe. And if you don't get the ratios right, you're just going to end up with some harder clay than what you anticipated. If you're doing raised garden beds, you can use you can use sand. In my raised garden beds, I did a mix of about 60% sand and 40% compost. And I really like this mix. The nice thing about the sand is it warms up fairly quickly. So my soil temperature of my raised beds, it is always warmer earlier than my soil temperature in the ground. And also the sand drains very well. So if I ever do get carried away with the compost and have some salt issues, it's very easy for me to manage that and leach or water out those extra salts past my plant root zone. And then again, organic matter is still very important in my raised beds. So my routine, I don't use fertilizers. I haven't needed to. What I will do is in the fall, I'll shred all my leaves that fall with my lawnmower and bag them, and then dump those on each of my raised beds. And then I'll grab a bag of compost just from the local nursery, and I'll spread the compost on top of those leaves. And that does two things. First, it holds the leaves down so they don't blow all over my yard. And two, it adds nitrogen to that carbon, and that makes the breakdown cycle go a whole lot faster. And I just let it sit all winter, and between the moisture we get in the winter and the great biology that you have in your soil, everything is broken down by spring, and I'm ready to plant. So I don't till, I don't need to fertilize. It's pretty simple, and it's been working for about I think I'm on year 10 with these raised beds. So I'm going to keep on doing what I'm doing. Just a few common pests that you are probably going to see. And if whenever you have pest issues, you can reach out to us at the Extension office. That's what we're there for, is to help you navigate these problems that you encounter. One of the big ones that I have an issue with in my garden is a leaf miner, and it gets in my spinach and in my chard. And there's a couple ways that you can avoid this. If I use the row fabric that I mentioned early on in the presentation, that helps tremendously. If I rotate my crops, which I also mentioned, that also helps. And then if you're still having an issue, you can start to bring in some of the insecticides. If I do get to a point where it gets fairly bad, I'll just cut the crop back completely and let it kind of come back again, and we'll see what the second round of crop looks like. I have noticed that I have less of an issue with this on my fall spinach than I do with my spring spinach. A few other things we see a lot are aphids, and not just in your vegetable garden. We see these on peaches quite a bit. Best thing you can do is monitor. Again, those row covers are going to help a lot, but I have seen situations where if the edges aren't down completely, or if you're planting your plants in the same space that you had an aphid problem the year before, they just kind of come back underneath that that cloth that you put on. So just monitoring frequently. Soap and water works really well on these. A high pressure from your nozzle works fairly well. And then there are quite a few insecticides that will help out as well. And there's a lot of beneficial insects. If you see these little scary looking things that's in that top picture, that's actually a ladybug larva. And these guys are pretty mean aphid eating machines. They do a whole lot better than their adult version does. So if you notice these in your garden, they're a good thing. Just leave them be, let them do their thing, and they'll help balance out the problem. And then we see a lot of spider mites, and spider mites are tricky to control with insecticides. There are miticides available, but we notice that when you spray those, you kill off everything, the good and the bad, and the bad tends to come back with full force, and there's nothing good there to balance it out. So we really don't recommend insecticides on these. A lot of monitoring, a lot of water. If you have plants that notoriously get spider mite damage and problems, if you just go out once a week with a nozzle on your hose that gives you some pressure and just give them a shower, that's going to get rid of those dusty, dirty conditions that they thrive in, and hopefully you'll see a positive impact. Thrips are another one that we see usually on onions. These are really small and kind of hard to see, but you'll notice some streaking in your onions or in your garlic, and sometimes in your chives. They don't usually do a whole lot of damage, but they can carry a virus, and so it is nice to control them. Overhead irrigation actually is one of the easiest ways to manage these. So if you've had thrip problems in the past, you may want to consider switching to an overhead irrigation on those crops versus a drip irrigation to receive that benefit. This is what thrip damage looks like on a tomato. So you can still eat this tomato, but it doesn't look, if you're selling for market, it's not something you would purchase in a grocery store. So a lot of the growers that sell for market they don't really appreciate this. But from a homeowner standpoint, you can still eat the tomato. All right, well, that's really all I had. Thank you guys for joining us. And again, we are here at USU to help you through your problems and help get you started. So if there's any questions that come up, please do not hesitate to reach out. And with that, if there are any questions, we'll get to those.
We do. Okay, so Candace, thank you so much. That was really helpful. So the first question we have is, when you're talking about your frost cloth, is this something that you keep on the whole growing season or just during the frost period? How long would you recommend that stays on?
That's a great question, and it really depends on what your goals are. If you're just using it for the frost side, you could take it off once the threat of frost has passed. If you're using it for insect protection, which I would highly recommend, you can actually leave it on all season.
All right, Candace, so tell me, when you plant broccoli, when is the best time? I think it was on one of your lists, but can you just remind us when's the best time to plant broccoli?
Yeah, you can. It's a cool season crop, so it likes the cool temperatures. And when it starts to get warm outside, it starts to get pretty bitter. And what's happening is it's starting to go into reproductive mode. It wants to stop producing what you want it to, and it wants to produce seeds so it can kind of live on. And so you want to plant it when it's cool. So you can do it in the spring, but if you've tried before and haven't had good luck, give it a shot in the fall. So plant it about end of July, first part of August, and see if you have better luck with that.
Oh, that sounds great. And cool season in the beginning, that would be like in April, beginning of April, or March?
Actually, about mid-March.
Mid-March.
Yeah.
Okay. That sounds great. Okay, next question. Brussels sprouts, if it went to seed, can you just leave it in your garden and it will start growing, it will produce Brussels sprouts again, or do you have to start completely over?
That is a really good question that I don't know. I really think it would depend on the type. If it was a hybrid variety, you'd probably want to start over. I don't know the answer to that question, but I could figure it out and get back to you.
Okay. That sounds great. Well, maybe we can put it in the comments later.
Okay.
Okay. What about, you were talking about transplants, and when you buy transplants, is there any benefit or non-benefit to if there's multiple plants? You know, sometimes there's multiple plants in that pot. Mm-hmm. So does it matter? Is it more stressful for the plants to be transplanted when you had several in one pot?
Yes and no. So let's use a tomato, for example. So if you purchase the tomato and there's 2 plants in there, the process of breaking them apart and planting them, it is stressful on the plant. But if they're young enough, they're going to bounce back fairly quickly, and it's not going to be an issue. So I've done it where I've purchased plants and there's 2 or 3 tomatoes in there, and I just break them up and plant them.
Okay.
If it's seeds that I started myself and I let them get a little too big before I plant it in, I'll usually pick the strongest one and just kind of snip the others back and then just plant that one.
Oh, okay. And would snip the other ones back, you actually plant those too, the small ones that you snipped back, or no?
No, I just snip them back and I'll just throw the clippings in the hole for organic matter.
Oh, huh, okay. All right, let's see here. How about any tips for pumpkins? Mine tend to die, or they make only one pumpkin. They put all the energy into one pumpkin and that's it.
Gotcha. You may want to check your nutrients just to make sure you're good from a nutrient standpoint. And then anything in the squash family is really susceptible to squash bugs, which if you've experienced those, they can get bad enough to where you just don't want to plant squash anymore. And they do stunt the plant quite a bit. So that might be part of the issue as well. And then also making sure they get pollinated. So if you don't have any bees in the area, you might have to hand pollinate just to make sure that fruit's able to set.
Okay. And how do you hand pollinate? You just like take a Q-tip and move it from flower to flower? Really?
Yep. Or a paintbrush or toothbrush. Yeah.
Okay. That's perfect. I think we're about out of time. Let me ask you one last question and we'll go from there. Can can plant-based compost burn the roots of your plants, or is it just animal compost?
Great question. So it's really just the animal compost. The plant-based compost is really low in salts, and so you don't get, which also translates into low in nutrients. So you don't get a whole lot of nutrients from those, but you get the soil composition benefits and soil improvement benefits. So I always tell folks that you really can't overdo it from a plant-based standpoint, but you can overdo it from the animal-based standpoint.
Okay, that is good to know. Candace, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us and sharing so much helpful information. We really
very welcome. Anytime. This was fun.
Oh, good. All right. Thank you so much.
You bet.
We'll see you later.